for a long time. Sometimes recycling, sometimes contamination, sometimes both at the same time. The panel today is a really esteemed group, and I encourage you to ask them questions at the end. Ask them the hard ones. The first person that you'll hear speaking is Charles Neslund. He's the scientific officer and the PFAS practice leader for Eurofins testing. Many of you have dealt with Eurofins before. You also will hear from Ralph DeMeo, who's a shareholder with Guilday Law. Ralph has been doing this kind of work in the Florida area and elsewhere in the Southeast for 40 years, 35, 40 years. Yeah. And the last person you'll speak with or hear from is Nick Albergo. Nick's with Ph.D. Services, again, has been around doing this for 35 years or at least. And the only thing I'm going to tell you to start off this discussion about PFAs is that if you have a lab and your lab samples for and fails to detect PFAs, you should fire them instantly, because these things are now ubiquitous. We didn't look for them before, and surprisingly, of course, we didn't find them. As we started looking for them maybe 3 or 4 or 5 years ago with a great degree of interest, the labs became very good. The detection limits are very good. But you'll hear, I think, from Ralph at least for sure, that the problem we're facing now is that the criteria that are being released by the agencies in many instances are arguably health-based, but in reality, in many instances, they are below the limits of detection that we can honorably support, which presents a real problem, because if you don't find it, is it really not there? We're really moving fast in this, and you'll hear that if you wait 10 or 15 minutes, this is all going to change, particularly with the new administration and whether there are changes at EPA that may be reflected in thoughts that haven't really been espoused by EPA in the past. So with that, I'm going to introduce the first speaker, Charles Neslund. He's going to speak about PFAS regulatory state of the union, what the recycling industry needs to know. And that, from a toxicological perspective, at least from my side, is the real reason we're here. If it couldn't hurt people, we wouldn't care about it. But now the question is, where's the exposure coming from? Charles?
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me here today. So we're going to talk about the PFAS regulatory state of the union, and I'm here to report that the state of the union is confusing. We're in a state we probably over the last 4 years ago, over 4 years ago, we were at a position where I think a lot of us contract laboratories, scientific professionals were hollering and screaming that there was no consistency across the U.S. with regard to PFAS, how to analyze for them, how to regulate them, and so each of the states, to varying degrees, started in on some form of regulation. Then over the last 4 years, and we're going to talk a little bit about the. Let me hit the right button here. Yes, sir. Whoop, there we go. Okay. Sorry about that. Over the last 4 years, we got started in on EPA's strategic roadmap, which is what they used to basically give direction to each and every one of these agencies with regard to what to do with regard to PFAS. So we're going to talk about that at a federal level and talk about the litany of action items that were organized by the program office. And before I get too far into it, I did want to make a comment about something we heard about a couple of things that we heard earlier. And because as we go through some of these regulations, some of the questions are going to be exactly how does this impact, or why is this impacting the recycling industry? Well, I can tell you, number one thing that we heard earlier about the U.S. is now a net importer of recycled plastic. And I can tell you from a lot of the contract work that we've done for clients to test raw materials for products that they manufacture and for raw products that are manufactured outside of the US, brought into the US, and then used in their products, that depending on where outside of the US a raw material is coming from, it has varying levels of PFAS. So to learn about recycled plastic being a net importer, that certainly impacts or influences the PFAS. So believe it or not, most of the items that were on the EPA's strategic roadmap have been checked off. Most of these slides I've included so that you're able to go back and reference what was done and which items didn't quite get to the finish line. But in today's talk, I'm going to try and focus on a few of the big ticket items. Thanks to the 2016 TSCA Reform Act, the Toxic Substances Control Act, EPA has made some real progress in terms of leveraging TSCA authorities to address PFAS. And EPA has initiated everything it set out to on this list. But some of these items have a longer life cycle, so they're not as impactful right now as others. So most notable was the one-time reporting obligation for all manufacturers regarding a list of PFAS used or imported since 2011. This is an adopted rule, but the reporting deadlines continue to get pushed back, with the most recent pushback being to January of 2026. The reality, though, is this reporting is a pretty heavy lift for a lot of folks, as the agency did not provide a specific list of PFAS, but rather a chemical definition. And in a couple slides later here, we've got where those 3 tiers of the chemical definition are listed. So what you ended up having was a lot of people looking at their products, the materials they bring in, the materials that they use, that for years, they had no idea whether or not it had PFAS because there wasn't a specific PFAS listed. PFAS were typically covered under a confidential business information item. So listed as an unknown surfactant or a proprietary fluorinated material. So PFAS basically said, if it meets this, if you get the chemical structure and it meets this, meets the criteria of this chemical structure, it's considered PFAS. You need to report on it. But as I said, that reporting has been pushed back to January of 2026. Then under the toxics release inventory, which is sort of at the other end of the spectrum because you have annual reporting that's required as a part of the toxic release inventory rule, which regulates the industry's emissions to air, land, and water. So companies have to report annually on emissions of any chemicals on the TRI. So the TRI lists specific chemicals also, different from how, as it relates to PFAS, different from how it's identified on TSCA. Congress mandated that PFAS be added to the TRI and instituted certain triggers for adding PFAS to the list every single year. The most notable development, though, was when EPA designated PFAS as chemicals of special concern. By labeling them as chemicals of special concern, now they're able to do away with the de minimis exemption, which a lot of manufacturers were able to use because the quantities that they emitted were below the threshold under TRI. But now that PFAS have been labeled as chemicals of special concern, that de minimis exemption has gone away. So we expect to see some potentially new and revealing information in July of 2025, which will be the first set of reports that are to include all facilities with previously de minimis levels. In October of 2024, EPA also proposed to add 16 individual PFAS and 15 PFAS categories, which represented over 100 individual PFAS to the TRI. But as that rule didn't make it over the finish line in time, we suspect that it's probably dead in the water with the new administration. DRI reports that are due this July, so there's a bit of a lag between the time when new updates are made and when we get to see the results of them. For the 2024 reporting year, which those reports are due this July, 196 PFAS are reportable. Over the course of 2024, they had already added the 5 PFAS that would be reportable for the 2025 reporting year, and the statutory triggers were to add another 9 earlier this year. But that rule got caught in one of the new administration's executive orders right now. So that's probably going to be pushed to the wayside. The changes to supplier notifications go into effect January 1st of this reporting year. So we should start to see activity on this front with those 196 new PFAS. So now we come to the Office of Water, and that's really where the bulk of the activity and the action over EPA over the last 4 years under their strategic plan occurred, where most of those initiatives are responsible. I won't have time to go through and won't go through all of these, but you'll have these slides available to you in a slide deck afterwards, so you can make reference to them. But basically, all of the items up there either were completed or got started, with the exception of the 2 at the bottom. And I'll talk about those updates that came close but didn't quite get to the finish line. So probably one of the most significant things that came out of the Office of Water was maximum contaminant levels for drinking water for a select list of PFAS. So we have final drinking water MCLs. They were adopted in April of 2024 and went into effect this last June of 2024. But there's an extended timeline for coming into compliance, which occurs at the end of 5 years from the date that they were implemented. So we've got MCLs for 5 PFAS. The ones you can see is, we have a button here. These 5 right here. So between 4, so we've got 4 PPT, that's parts per trillion, not parts per thousand. So 4 parts per trillion for PFOA and PFOS. And then the hexane sulfonic acid, the nonanoic acid, and then what's commonly referred to, that acronym up there, HFPODA, Gen X, known as Gen X, at 10 parts per trillion. They also instituted something called the Health Hazard Index, which is basically you take the concentration of any one of these 4 detected compounds, divide it by its MCL or its health hazard level, and then add those fractions. If the fractions, the sum of the fractions exceeds 1, your drinking water supply is not in compliance. I can tell you that with the drinking waters that we analyze, especially, for example, out of New Jersey, we routinely will see hits for PFNA and Gen X that are on the order of 4 or 5, maybe 6 parts per trillion, that by themselves aren't an exceedance. But if you take 6 for one of them, divide it by 10, that's 0.6. If you take 5 for another one and divide it by 10, that's 0.5. We've got 1.1. So that's a health hazard exceedance right there. So you can see we're talking pretty low levels for this. I should have said before I bumped the slide to say it probably should come as no surprise that this rule was immediately contested in the courts. But in an interesting turn of events, the EPA just secured a stay by the U.S. Court of Appeals to allow the new leadership at the agency time to familiarize itself with the issue, as the agency may seek to rework the rule. They have 60 days to do that as of February 10th. The process for arriving at a federal drinking water process for arriving at a federal drinking water standard starts with something called the Unregulated Contaminant Monitoring Rule. Everyone know what the UCMR is? Anyone? That's something that's dictated by the Safe Drinking Water Act that EPA on 5-year cycles collect this, what's called the contaminant compound list or chemicals of concern list, and basically boil it down to lists of compounds to assay the nation's drinking waters. So that UCMR 5, the 5th iteration of that, is being done right now. And the scope of that, I want to point out, is PFAS centric. There are a total of 29 analytes that are PFAS out of these 2 methods. And then the 30th analyte, Nick is going to be talking about, which is lithium, lithium batteries, right? So, and there I've got a summary of the results to date. So EPA has already jumped ahead on putting levels out with regard to the rule that we just talked about. But what we want to keep our eye on is a proposal for which contaminants will be monitored during the 6th UCMR, which is the next cycle coming up. And that proposal we expect to see that proposal sometime later this summer. So often the contaminants selected for monitoring on the UCMR come from the contaminants candidate list. So I botched up CCL before, but contaminant candidate list. And here in this, when I mentioned earlier under TSCA, so I know I'm jumping back and forth on this a little bit, but TSCA talked about chemical definition for classes of PFAS as opposed to identifying specific PFAS. Well, here are the definitions, these items 1, 2, and 3, and you can read those. And unless you're a chemistry nerd, like a couple of us, it's probably not going to, it doesn't easily point to something like PFOA or Gen X unless you know and understand that specific structure. In January, a part of EPA's efforts going back to January of 2023, they released what's called a Final Effluent Guideline Program. Final Effluent Guideline Program. So they basically were identified several different groups of industries, whether it be chemical manufacturing, polymer manufacturing, oil and gas. And you can see a number of them: pulp and paper, paperboard, electrical components, landfills. Said that they would not pursue further action. But then later in 2023, the National Defense Authorization Act came out and basically said, and you know, the NDAA is where the money is, right? That's where the money comes from. So they basically said, and I'm probably incorrectly paraphrasing, but for this money, you're going to have to stipulate timeframes for regulating and monitoring these different effluent groups for their impact to the environment. And you can see the dates that we've got listed here. So now, even though this was mandated by Congress, EPA submitted these ELGs for the chemicals and plastics and synthetic fibers to OMB for review, but those were just pulled from OMB as part of one of Trump's executive orders for their ability to review the previous rulemaking. So now we'll see how the administration chooses to address the other industrial discharges. And that's why early on when I said the State of the Union, it's in flux. So there was some action on some things that got to the finish line, and there are others that were midstream that the new administration said, hang on, we want to reevaluate. Also, as a part of that, EPA wanted to initiate a nationwide study of POTWs and influent, effluent, and biosolids analysis for that. This would have included analysis by 2 analytical methods, EPA 1633 and EPA 1621, which are relatively within the last year, hot off the presses. but that too has been delayed. So whether or not they actually will get the money and funding and direction to be able to do that, that work is unknown at this time. Even though EPA's efforts to establish effluent limit guidelines may be stalled currently, the agency has reminded the states back as early as 2022 that the states who have NIPD's authority for most wastewater discharge, NIPD's National Pollution Elimination discharge elimination, that the states, and basically gave them a roadmap for how to proceed with writing NIPD's permits in their states that would be applicable to their states. The problem, though, is that the problem is that the two methods that I mentioned before, method 1633 and method 1621, typically for NIPD's permits, you're referencing a method that has been published and accepted as part of Federal Register, part of CFR. However, EPA since long released we were calling them draft methods, and then they did finalize the methods towards the end of last year, but didn't get them into Federal Register until January 31st of this year. So unfortunately, that was one day after Trump's executive order to halt any rulemaking that was in progress. Of course, this has already been contested, and as I think we'll hear from Ralph, that a lot of what we're talking about here, whether it's analytical or legislative, I think is going to ultimately be decided in the courts and through litigation. So now we'll see about the fate of these two methods and how the states decide to grapple with them. Will states decide to go ahead and pursue NIPD's permits with a draft method, or are they going to wait till there is something final and promulgated? Lastly, EPA checked one of their boxes, one of their final boxes by publishing a draft risk assessment for PFOA and PFOS, only those two compounds and biosolids. Nothing really illuminating here except that essentially the modeling shows that for a very narrow population, those that are living on or near impacted properties may be at risk from land applied or disposed biosolids with PFOA or PFOS concentrations above a part per billion. So that's low, but relative to what we're looking at in drinking water, that seems relatively high. So there's some risk assessed, but I think we're a long way from any specific actions there. And I need to bump through a couple of these because I'm running to the end here. 5 minutes, thank you. So just quickly, under CERCLA, Office of Land and Emergency Management. So you may know or have heard that PFOA and PFOS as a part of the strategic roadmap were in fact, as of July 8th, listed as CERCLA hazardous substances. Of course, this is the most critical part. The most critical part of the acronym is compensation and liability under that acronym. So the most significant implications would be are related to cleanup action. So EPA, this gives EPA authority to order the investigation and remediation of these chemicals, including cost recovery, reopen closed sites. Private parties would have a cause of action for cost recovery, and PFOA and PFOS will be included in the scope of phase ones in order to satisfy all appropriate inquiries rules. Under RCRA, so on the bump to this. So on the heels of the CERCLA designation, EPA made a move to list the 9 PFAS that are listed here as hazardous constituents, not hazardous waste, because under RCRA, you've got a two-step process. First, it's to list it as a hazardous constituent in Appendix 8, which it just did. and then also publish a finding that PFAS containing waste could pose a substantial present or potential hazard to human health or the environment when improperly treated, stored, transported, or disposed of, or otherwise managed. They haven't gotten step 2 done yet, so it remains a hazardous constituent and not a hazardous waste. But with that said, there has been some statutory action by the governor of New Mexico that has sort of pushed the envelope for getting these listed as moving it towards hazardous waste. So EPA was up against a congressional deadline to update destruction techniques. And although not much progress has been made, there's some additional recommendations regarding how to measure destruction technologies. So DOD for incineration at one point was banned to rid PFAS, whether it's a recycled material, whether it's AFFF you're trying to get rid of, or biosolids. The EPA had banned incineration as a destruction technique. DOD wrote an exemption to that, which EPA bought into. And EPA said they generally agreed with the guidance, but pointed out data gaps with regard to things called products of incomplete combustion and whether or not you're completely mineralizing PFAS. So it's a classic example, potentially classic example of you're doing this effort to destroy the known bad, but you're creating an potentially unknown bad. So careful what you ask for. And then just for fun, we're throwing a little speculation about the new administration. EPA made great progress on the roadmap, but will the work continue? We're officially at the end of the strategic roadmap, strategic plan for PFAS. So will this be reinitiated? Will there be new specific directives with regard to PFAS? Administrator Zeldin, who was confirmed, has a history of supporting PFAS legislation, but he's answering to a different boss now. So we'll need to see where that goes. And it's likely going to take some time for the new administration to articulate its agenda as it relates to PFAS. Although, oftentimes, it's as much about who's in Congress and who's controlling certain actions in Congress as it is who's present in the executive branch. An example of that is the new chair of the Environmental and Public Works Committee, Senator Shelley Moore Capito, if I pronounce that correctly, out of West Virginia. She has vowed to ease the drinking water regulation and to provide CERCLA liability waivers to passive receivers, which would potentially have an impact to POTWs and to recycling facilities. And then the last two is the last one is to just bring back, talk about this Congressional Review Act of 1996, which is really a look back mechanism, which allows Congress to look back to certain acts or decisions or things that were put in place at the very end of the prior administration and gives them authority to halt them, re-review them, and re-propose them. So I suspect a lot of that will be going on. But it's our understanding that the drinking water MCLs and the CERCLA hazardous substance designations are basically safe from that look back period, which means easier undoing may not happen there. And with that, thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Charles. Is there a question or two that Charles can answer, or do you want to hold them till the end? Okay. I'll now introduce Ralph DeMeo. Ralph's a shareholder at the Guilday law firm in Tallahassee, and he and I have worked together for probably 40 years. I'll mention one thing while Ralph's getting set up about the comments that Charles made about biosolids. Of course, when you treat water with a variety of different processes, you end up with biosolids that then have to be disposed of. We worked on a site where there was a proposed sludge spreading operation that was going to be conducted. And the issues that were being looked at were chlorinated solvents from water wastewater treatment and metals like arsenic and chromium and cadmium. And at one point, because of the PFA's knowledge that Ralph and I had, we pointed out to the county commission, we were not in favor of this, but we were pointing out to the county commission that, have you thought about PFAs, which are absolutely positively going to be present in your biosolids? That caused them to ask the permit requester to answer that question. They couldn't, and it pretty much killed the project. This is going to be a question that's asked over and over and over again in the next few years for the reasons that Charles mentioned, for what Ralph's going to talk about now, and what ultimately Nick may speak about in addition to the lithium questions.
Thanks, Chris. I'm glad you mentioned that, and congratulations to Jean for putting together another excellent program. I have been practicing environmental law for about 40 years, and I also teach environmental law at Florida State College of Law and Stetson College of Law, and I've had the pleasure of working with Chris for many, many years. The interesting thing about his example is that there was no regulation in place at the time. It predated the federal proposed rule. And that is kind of a theme that I want to have you focus on, because people are panicking, especially people in the environmental community. The DEP was pursuing people before there was a proposed rule at the federal level, certainly at the state level. And I believe that will continue. More on that in a minute. But I want to tell you something funny. EPA has been studying these PFAS contaminants for decades, literally. Before November 8th, 2016, they were on the verge of issuing some proposed rule. They had guidance in place at the time, right? Which to the state of Florida means a rule, even though the lawyers know that it isn't technically a rule. On November 9th, 2016, I did a presentation to a group on environmental regulation in general, and included PFAS. And I said something I've never said before and never thought I'd say again. You might have to ignore every single thing I'm going to tell you, because there could be a sea change in regulations. And sure enough, there was, because the first Trump term, on the very first day of office, he did very much what he did this time, and he froze all the federal regulations, and he pulled PFAS off the priority agenda, and certainly it wasn't going anywhere near CERCLA. Well, I had a similar presentation on November 4th. I don't know why these people want to hold conferences the day after a federal election. Joe Biden, in his platform, before he was elected, identified a single contaminant of concern that he was going to focus his agency on. Guess what it was? PFAS. It's in his agenda. And sure enough, he fast-tracked EPA to come up with a proposed rule and the listing of a hazardous substance. And we know that that happened within a couple of years. Now, fast forward to November of 6th, 2024, the day after the federal election, I did a similar presentation, and I said the same thing. Everything is up in the air now. And that's what you're hearing from Charles and the rest of us. We truly don't know where this is going. Now I'm going to skip over, because Charles did a good job of covering some of the regulatory stuff. I do want to focus, though, for the benefit of the audience here, things that you probably already know, and this is why you should be concerned. And bear in mind what I said a minute ago. Don't take too much comfort in the fact that the current administration in Washington has pulled this off the fast track. Food packaging, processed with equipment that use PFAS or grown in PFAS contaminated soil or water, commercial household products, including stain and water repellent fabrics, non-stick products such as Teflon, polishes, waxes, paints, cleaning products, carpets, firefighting foams, right? In the workplace, you're talking about a number of industries where PFAS is very prevalent, drinking water, of course. And my favorite one that Chris and I talk about a lot, living organisms, including fish, animals, and humans, where PFAS has the ability to build up and persist over time. Now, more on this in a minute. You heard a little bit about the question about health effects, but there's been plenty of litigation, and I'm going to talk in a minute about the multi-billion-dollar settlements that have taken place even without a federal standard. So again, I'm going to keep repeating that. even without a federal standard. There's been settlements, okay? All right, so I'm going to skip over this because Charles mentioned that. This is in my materials if you want to go back and look at it. As you heard in January, the Trump EPA withdrew a pending Biden administration plan that would have protected public health by setting discharge limits on these forever chemicals and as a listing as a hazardous substance, coupled with the executive order placing a freeze on new federal regulations. The future of PFAS regulation, not liability, regulation is in doubt. Now, what's particularly interesting is 2 years ago, I worked with Kina and others, stakeholders, airports, landfills, et cetera. And we stopped the DEP from moving forward with their own rule or to further enforce PFAS. They had in place what was kind of euphemistically called a provisional rule, but that meant to the regulators that they could pursue you for that provisional rule. Well, they had to freeze all those activities, all those enforcement activities until January of 2025. And then when the president came along and froze the federal rule because the state was required by that legislation to begin rulemaking, and the understanding from the Waste Division was that they were going to go ahead and move forward to adopt the federal number, the 4. Well, now that we don't have a federal number, the state didn't know what to do. It was under legislative mandate to move forward with rulemaking. So my understanding is that they're going to the legislature, and they've already gotten support from the governor and from the leadership in the Senate and the House. They're going to ask for another 3 years extension to move forward with any implementation, which is a good and a bad thing, okay? It's a good thing because there's too much flux, too much uncertainty about the numbers. It's a bad thing because it leaves everybody in limbo. Okay, now I work with about a half a dozen airports, commercial airports. Were required, and actually still are to this day, to use the AFFF foams. The primary foam that's used has high levels of PFAS in it. Last summer, the FAA approved another non-PFAS containing foam. I work with a number of fire departments, and all the fire chiefs are very concerned because, first of all, they still have stockpiles of the very expensive AFFF foam. Secondly, they've trained their people, their firefighters, on the use of the original AFFF foam, and they're not certain that the new foam is as effective. To prove the point, FAA was asked, well, will you go ahead and indemnify any of the airports or any firefighters that use this new AFFF foam? And they said, no, we won't. And so we don't know. We don't know what's going to happen there. But at the federal level, I can tell you that there's a number of groups, the airport groups and others, who are working on federal legislation, and they've gotten some sponsors. I don't think it's been filed yet, to my knowledge, to immunize at least airports. And again, come back to the point I just made, they have been required for decades to use this foam, and they've been using it, and it's gotten into the environment, and it's highly persistent. The toxicology of it is maybe an issue. I'll ask Chris to comment on that in a minute, but just stop and think about that from a public policy, not to mention, if I can use the word, fairness point of view. You are required to use this. If you're a commercial airport, meaning you're licensed by the FAA, you will lose your license if you don't use this foam. And they have to use it in training as well as in actual firefighting. So now we're going to come back and tell you you're liable for the fact that you used it. It's fundamentally unfair. And I think that's the basis for the legislation that's being discussed. Again, I'm gonna skip over some of these regulatory things. But if I could take a moment, I asked Chris, would he comment on the DEP's provisional rule, but then the EPA's proposed rule?
Sure. One of the things that is really uncertain in here is that these numbers are specific numbers. They're based on an assumption that the non-carcinogenic effects of the perfluorinated alkyl substances are the driving factor for a health risk concern. And that's what generated these low numbers. More recently, I've started to hear that the agency, and again, maybe this is all in flux as of November 5th, they were going to recalculate all these values based on the potential carcinogenic potency factors. It would make these numbers look giant compared to what you'll generate if you use carcinogenic potency factors. So we went from essentially zero values to way, way below zero values now. So it's a blind spot in the way the regulations are developed, in the sense that they focus specifically on the way criteria have always been developed, use the same algorithms and the same approaches for pulling tox values, but now you're generating a number that's completely unmanageable in the environmental sense. So, as Ralph said, you have people who have been obligated to use something which is now going to be illegal, and they have to clean up areas that they were obligated to contaminate. So it's really interesting. But from a toxicological perspective, if the idea of using the carcinogenic potency factors replaces the non-cancer hazard values, these numbers are going to look like you wish you had these, as opposed to what ones will be generated. So we'll see. Flux is the right word. It's in complete flux. The agencies don't know what to do with the mandate they have or haven't been given, depending upon who you talk to, and whether or not they have to proceed or don't. DEP's values are simply an adoption, for the most part, of the EPA regs. They rarely vary from that. Certainly don't vary from the way in which their calculated values are done. You know, in the 80s, it was benzene. In the 80s and 90s, it was arsenic. PFAs are going to make those two things look like nothing at all in terms of the regulatory strategy that'll be needed if these approaches go forward. And I can't really tell you that as a toxicologist, I worry about being exposed to parts per trillion levels of PFAs. I don't. And I just don't know if we want to spend our entire federal budget cleaning up things that may or may not even matter.
And one of my favorite of many Chris Teaf-isms is, I always say, so if I'm exposed to PFAS at that level, will it kill me? And he always says, well, I can assure you something will kill you, but not that. So I take some great comfort in hearing him say that. And the other thing he has pointed out is at 4, you've already heard about detection limits and lab capabilities. It's basically 0. There's basically no amount of PFAS under the proposed federal rule. And as Charles said, both that proposed EPA rule, even apart from the stay, and the listing rule under Circle and RECRA are both under legal challenge. And I haven't seen yet, I assume there might be a stay of that litigation as well. You heard there's a stay of their ability to move forward with it, but I don't know what's going to happen with that. Nobody knows. I commented on behalf of the airports. They received almost 10,000 comments when the proposed rule came out, by far more comments than they'd receive anywhere else. And it came from the sources you would assume: public water supply systems, airports, landfills, firefighters. And let me tell you a quick anecdote. In one of my conversations with the fire chief from a major metropolitan city in Florida, after I explained to him, this was 4 or 5 years ago, what was going on here and what his choices are, he was listening very carefully. And he said, all right, Ralph, well, let me ask you this. So a large jumbo jet comes in for a landing, crash lands on my airport. It's on fire. There's 260 people on board. I mobilize my team. We rush out there, and we've got AFFF foam with screaming high levels of PFAS in it. There's drainage ditches all around that empty into other surface water bodies and a direct conduit to the groundwater. So I've got to make a management decision. I either say, I'm going to not use this foam because I don't want to subject my local government and the citizens to multi-million dollars of liability and harm the environment, or I'm going to use it and not let people burn up and die. What do you think I'm going to do? And yet the government comes along, the state and federal government, and says, you're still liable for that use and for that risk management decision. Again, fundamental unfairness. We're hopeful that that anecdote and others like it will not fall on deaf ears. Okay, well, again, I'm going to move on from this, but this is the statewide survey that the state did a couple of years ago. You heard mention of the DEP had its own dynamic plan. I've already mentioned the legislation and the enforcement abatement. The state wasn't happy about it. I should tell you And I got some great friends at the DEP. They lobbied against this legislation. They did not want this enforcement abatement to go into effect when it did. They wanted to come after all of us. They sent out dozens of enforcement letters telling people, do the assessment or else we will bring in our own consultant and do it ourselves. And those assessments continue to this day. They haven't stopped. Now, you heard mention of legislation. This was the original bill. I can't read the date of it, but it was about 6, 7 years ago that that Congress first moved forward. This was under the first, actually it was before Trump, so it was about 8 years ago, Trump won. He put an end to this pretty quick. So there hasn't been that legislation since until a couple of years ago under Biden, when the legislation reemerged and it started to have legs, as they say. Well, now it's back to, it's in a holding pattern, if you will. Okay. Now, mindful of the fact this is a recycling conference, these are just a few suggestions. One of the companies that is involved in recycling that's been paying a lot of attention to PFAS. And look, it's tempting to say, well, it hasn't really bitten me yet, or, well, there's a stay in the regulations. Don't sleep on it. Don't sleep on your rights, because it's coming in some form or another. And as I said, you'll see in a minute why you should be concerned. It hasn't stopped the litigation. It hasn't stopped the liability being imposed, okay? It's going to continue. But basically, there are some ways to deal with this, obviously starting with identification of PFAS-containing products. You saw the long list, and that was not a complete list of the materials that make it into your waste stream, whether you have a landfill or a recycling operation. I mean, look at all these things, right? PFAS, for example, are found in corrosion-resistant coatings and sealings, right? Look at that list of things. Review the product specifications. Consult with the company. See whether it's in their products or not. Again, this is just one company. Where feasible, disassemble the components, segregating those with PFAS and without PFAS. I understand that's a burden. It adds to the cost, the labor cost, but you're looking to avoid liability and problems down the road. And then, of course, proper disposal, okay? These are just common sense things that some, but I can tell you, not most companies are dealing with quite yet. Collaborate with certified recycling facilities. I have the privilege of working with one down in Ocala. Some of you know Florida Environmental Waste and Recycling. They're very careful about how they manage their products, about where they put them. They have a couple of landfills, MRFs, things like that. But again, don't be cavalier about all this. There are some facilities that actually specialize in managing PFAS-containing materials. Then I like this extended producer responsibility, which is basically, if you will, BMPs for responsible management of PFAS-containing products. Let me say this, if you're not doing it now, sooner or later you're going to have to. Okay, and then you can strive to have a more sustainable approach to managing these products. They call it the forever chemical because it is everywhere. I get asked all the time, should we test for it? And I always say, as I told Chris earlier, only if you want to find it, because the probability is you're going to find it. But I don't call it the forever chemical. I call it the everywhere chemical because it is everywhere, okay? I work with dozens of facilities, some that are not obvious, wastewater treatment plants, right? Chris mentioned the biosolids disposal site. We called DEP, which had issued a notice of intent, was going to give this facility, it was like 500-acre facility, to dispose of biosolids coming from all over Central Florida. And we called the DEP project manager and said, by the way, in the application, did you request that they test for PFAS constituents? And there was crickets on the other end. He hello, are you still there? Did you hear me?
Say what?
Yeah, say what? And he got back with me later. He informed the applicant that this could be a concern. The applicant at first resisted, and he eventually dropped his application. And I talked to him later, and I said, hey, what happened? He goes, I couldn't overcome that. And think about it. That stopped a multi-million-dollar investment in a biosolids disposal facility because of PFAS, before there was a regulation. Okay, I'll keep going. There was a recent study. You can take a look at the slide on landfill leachates in Florida containing PFAS. Pretty high levels there, as you can imagine, because of all the products that end up there. And leachate collection and monitoring and all of that is wonderful and great, and we need it, but it doesn't capture everything. All right, so let's shift to, how much time do I have roughly?
10 minutes.
All right, let's talk about the litigation. I do a lot of litigation. I have 4 cases on behalf of local governments, both airports and firefighting facilities, in the federal litigation called the multi-district litigation. There are over 2,000 plaintiffs in that suing all of the PFAS manufacturers, okay? It's been going on for about 6 years, 7 years now. And let's just say it hasn't been going well for the manufacturers. We're talking about multinational, multi-billion-dollar companies like 3M and DuPont and Chemours and others, and they've lost virtually every motion they brought. First, they challenged the lack of a standard. That didn't go anywhere. Then they relied upon what's called the governmental contractors defense, which is, well, we've been selling to government agencies, and so we shouldn't be held accountable. Well, that didn't go anywhere. They tried experts. Their experts were basically overruled by the plaintiffs group. The judge was not having it, okay? These cases are still pending. They haven't gone away. As I mentioned, just because there's a stay, these were filed before there was a rule, and they're going to continue. And let's talk about what's at stake here, okay? First of all, these are all the Florida just Florida alone, all these cases. You can see there's a lot. And most interestingly, the state of Florida itself has jumped in as well and filed its own case. The state of Florida has sued these manufacturers because they realize, the state, that they don't have the money to pay for the cleanups. And you're going to see why in a minute. And if it's going to be a problem and it's not going away, then the manufacturers ought to be the ones to pay the freight. And by the way, you know, I've worked on cases on behalf of chemical manufacturers, landfill companies, et cetera, but they knew 40, 50 years ago about these risks. It's very analogous to the tobacco litigation, where the tobacco companies denied risk to human health for decades, and then later it was proven that they knew, okay? So that's why you don't want to feel too sorry for them. The bellwether case, bellwether in federal litigation means, because there's thousands of cases, really, we can't try them all at the same time, and we don't want to risk inconsistent judgments or verdicts. So we pick a case, you know, the bell cow, if you will, and that was little old city of Stewart down in Martin County. And they were the very first one to go forward. We were all watching it anxiously. Literally the night before this multi-month trial was supposed to start, we all got notice that there was a settlement in the works, okay?
Were you surprised?
Not really, because look at these numbers, okay? Again, these are staggering. I want to point out, this is just one category, and it's not even the biggest category of cases. This is public water systems where PFAS has been found or is likely to be found, right? So 3M alone committed to paying up to $12.5 billion, right? Intended to address public water systems, right? You see Chemours, DuPont, Corteva, and other defendants agreed to contribute $1.8 billion. The reason their share is smaller is because 3M was the big actor in all of this. Tyco, another one, agreed to pay $750 million. BASF, 312, et cetera. Okay, so this is what I'm talking about when I say these are huge numbers, and this is maybe 20%, if that, of all the cases that are pending. The other two categories of cases are what are referred to by the court as environmental cases, which are non-public water system cases. Well, those are the lion's share of cases, okay? Where the groundwater, for example, in Florida is contaminated. Surface waters in Florida are contaminated, but they're not drinking water supplies or sources, okay? All right, so I mentioned the public water system cases. Those appear to have been resolved for the most part. There's an opt-in, opt-out provision, but it would be unwise not to opt into the settlement. All right. Now I'm going to give you some context here. And I was actually involved in a couple of these mass tort bellwether type cases, one of which was the original Johns Manville asbestos litigation that some of you might remember, which was sort of at the time the granddaddy of them all. You still see ads on late night TV for mesothelioma settlements. The other one was the tobacco litigation, as I said. So the 1998 master settlement was $206 billion. They're still paying. Several companies went kaput. The asbestos settlement was $30 billion. Johns Manville went bankrupt. Philip Morris's tobacco settlement, $28 billion. Okay. The BP Deepwater Horizon, some of you remember that? Not too far from here, $60 billion. Okay. What's the estimated cost to assess and remediate? Nobody knows. One of my bad jokes is that there's not enough gold in Fort Knox, and that might literally be true. Okay. All right. Now I should mention also that at least one, and there's rumors that other of these manufacturers have already filed for bankruptcy protection, which means, you know, pennies on the dollar, and more are expected. Now, let me read to you another statistic in the last couple of minutes here. The third major category of these PFAS cases that are pending are personal injury cases, okay? These have nothing to do with the government. These are brought by the major, you see their ads on billboards and on buses, and I try to resist the temptation not to run into them or shoot them, but they're out there. They're signing up literally thousands of plaintiffs. They've been waiting to see what happens with the rulemaking, but now that that's going to be on hold for a while, they're starting to come forward with these settlements, and they're massive with these lawsuits, and they're massive. So let me okay, thanks. Let me read to you some numbers, okay? In one Midwestern state, a firefighters union brought a lawsuit on behalf of all of their firefighters. The settlement, this was about 5 years ago, was $750 billion, okay? Close to $1 trillion. That's just one state, all right? Here's some of the way the numbers break down. So a typical plaintiff would get between $200,000 and $500,000 for cases with severe health conditions like kidney or pancreatic cancer. Again, as Chris said, there's questions about whether there's causation there, but that's what the settlements are looking like. The mid-tier ones are 150 to 300. Lower tier cases with less severe conditions, about 75,000. What are the factors here? And these are the personal injury cases. The more severe the health issues, the higher the settlement amount, of course. The longer the exposure, the higher the settlement amount, and the litigation is, you know, the skills of the lawyer and the court that you're in, et cetera. Now, again, these are personal injury cases. I'm actually defending one of those right now on behalf of a local government, not a manufacturer, that was sued by one of its residents that says it was exposed to PFAS and the drinking water. So massive problem. Multi-trillion-dollar, whatever the rule comes out, whatever listing, let's pray it doesn't come under CERCLA, because that's a whole nother nightmare. You know, not only can you recover response costs, but you can get attorney's fees and consultants costs for that too. So think about that. And you, as you heard from Charles, private parties can bring these actions. So they're coming. Take it seriously. I really appreciate you all being here. And if you have any questions, let me know.
Thanks, Rob.
Other question or two? Yes, sir.
Thank you. The Stewart 3M issue, for example, who's funding these losses? I mean, I doubt 3M was carrying $30 billion in insurance limits. And
Well, that's a really good question. The insurance companies, big surprise, have denied coverage. And if you, just much like as what happened with the old comprehensive general liability policies, where a U.S. Supreme Court case said that it has to be sudden and accidental, which means an explosive event, so small leaks and spills over years aren't covered. Same thing's happening here. They're writing out of their policies PFAS coverage, claiming it was never intended to be covered. So the answer is 3M's a pretty big company and they're funding it right now, but I don't see that in, I mean, they don't have trillions of dollars. None of them do collectively.
we've seen the PFAS exclusions in the last 3 or 4 years, but
Yeah.
depending on the age of the policy that they're invoking, the exclusion wasn't specifically in there before.
Right, well,
But
same thing happened with the comprehensive general liability policies. It was retroactive. So the court said, well, this was never intended to be covered.
oh,
So-
the leaky UST where every individual drop was in and of itself a separate and complete
Yeah,
fund.
those
and
are
that-
the
that all
arguments,
agree-
but in Florida, that hasn't worked.
Okay.
So that's the bottom line. That's why I say, well, look, when something like this happens, there's only one way, there's only one place to look, and that's the government, and that's the federal government, right? But I don't know in this environment whether that's going to happen. They're either going to pay trillions of dollars to resolve all these problems, or they're going to pull back on the regulations, or maybe even immunize people. Don't know. Thank you.
Thanks, Ralph. Appreciate it very much.
Yep.
You may want to take the time to try to corner some of these guys afterwards and see if you can get some answers to specific questions that you might have. We're going to switch gears now from perfluorinated alkyl substances to lithium batteries. And I know that although you all don't generate these things, you have to deal with them, and sometimes the consequences of having to handle them turn out to be your biggest costs or management questions. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Nick Albergo, and I look forward to hearing about this.
Thanks. You know what's crazy is maybe 1 in 4 of us get cancer anyway, right, in this country. So how do you even start to look at what the additive effect of PFAS or any of this stuff is? So my name is Nick Albergo. I own an engineering firm based in the Southeast, about 400 people. I sold in 2013 and went back to the university to teach. I'm at USF, University of South Florida, where I do my best to contaminate the minds of the next generation of engineers. I'm going to talk about lithium and specifically with regards to recycling, which I thought was going to be a really exciting thing to talk to a bunch of recyclers about, but much as what you've heard so far is going to apply to lithium as well. And that's that things are changing quick. Probably by lunchtime, something else will have changed as well. So far, most of the efforts to build our charging station infrastructure associated with EVs has been killed and squashed now. So there was about $7 billion that was in play for our charging stations. In addition to that, our efforts to look at domestic mining and domestic availability of rare earth minerals has pretty much been squashed as well. Bottom line is, you know, whether you love them or hate them, there may actually be some benefit in taking a pause administratively with regards to the electrical vehicle market. And that's because we've got a big challenge in trying to identify domestically these rare earth minerals. And as well, we really don't have the regulatory infrastructure in place to guide what we do with end-of-life lithium ion batteries for vehicles. And as such, there may be a benefit in actually taking a bit of a pause. There had been a bit of pushback now, even before the Trump administration, about the fact that, you know, these electrical vehicles are about 3 times heavier than regular cars, and they've been using our roads and not paying anything for the maintenance of the roads. And so there's been some efforts that have been renewed to create some additional funding to help with defer the costs of continued maintenance on our roads in the form of $1,000 point of sale for electrical vehicles, and then another price to be paid for the batteries themselves. And this really, you know, is something that we'll probably see in the future. You all are recyclers, you already know this, but there's nothing really green about electric vehicles. In fact, in many respects, they are less green than our combustion cars. There had been some efforts at the EPA level to propose some new rules to improve the recycling of end-of-life batteries. And there's a good reason for it. If you look at the right-hand side, you can see that there's a great benefit in trying to extract lithium and other rare earth minerals from recycled material versus trying to go after raw ore to get the same amount. And as a result, there have been some pushes towards developing that market, which in the United States, we really don't have much of, especially for the electric vehicles. And most of that is now dead based on the movement of the new administration. Even so, I think that ultimately there will be some opportunities for the recycling industry in this area. The bottom line is that exploiting these types of minerals is complicated, okay? And it's going to continue to be complicated, and for a number of reasons. For one, mining's never been very popular in the United States. It's very energy intensive, it's very water intensive, and as a result, there's a lot of damage that occurs. And so the idea of trying to mine in the United States would be complicated anyway. In addition to that, we've got what I call the valley of death, which is essentially the fact that we're not, at least currently, able to make the transition from, proven production type models versus what we've got currently in the development phase, where we're looking at geothermal and oil field brines. We've got some ideas on how we might be able to extract these rare earth minerals, but they're not ready for prime time, so to speak, just yet. And the greatest challenge is we just don't have the reserves that exist in other parts of the world. And even the reserves we do have are of a much lower grade in terms of the quality of the minerals than they are in other places. China controls this market, primarily because even after you extract the minerals from other places in the world, they typically go to China for the refining. The refining of these minerals is an entirely different expertise than the extraction is, and China controls that entire market pretty much. And so the idea of trying to get that or pull that back domestically is going to be a challenge. And then probably the biggest challenge we've got is one that you've heard about already with PFAS, and that's that we already got a lithium issue in our groundwater in this country. The USGS had actually done some investigation and looked at groundwater and wells throughout the country, and we've got a collision coming. If we were to attempt to do something to develop our own domestic supplies, but more importantly for you all as recyclers, if this is something you're interested in, there's going to be a challenge associated with where you do your recycling and what the ramifications are when compared to the land that you're setting on in terms of how much lithium is already there. Now, you've already heard about the UCMR5, so I won't go into that, but you heard that lithium is the 30th chemical that they've decided that they wanted to look at. And of course, what comes out of this whole effort ultimately is whether or not certain of these PFAS compounds or lithium gets added to our MCL list, or our national priority for drinking water. So when it comes to lithium right now, we have established some minimal risk levels at about 9 micrograms per liter, parts per billion. And if we were to extract this, if you will, just some rule of thumb numbers using reference doses, we'd probably, if we had a drinking water standard for lithium today, is probably going to be somewhere around 60 to 70 micrograms per liter, parts per billion. And the challenge with that is that if you look at the data that was generated by the USGS, you can see that in large areas of our country, we're already there in terms of our groundwater numbers. And so for those of you that are familiar with Superfund, you recognize that, liability is strict. Fault is not a prerequisite. If you're on land that's contaminated, it's your responsibility to clean it up. Well, I think that, you all as recyclers be hard pressed to open up a new shop where you're doing lithium recycling on groundwater that's already precariously close to being above drinking water standards as it is. And I think that that's going to be a huge challenge as we move forward if we're actually going to talk about trying to promote additional recycling in the United States for lithium batteries. And I'm talking about EV batteries, not the small ones. Now, all of these slides, of course, have had to be changed since the new administration came in. We were definitely all in on this whole thing. I was ready to tell you all about how great this market's going to be, that there's a tremendous amount of money and they're going to push more money at it. And the reality is it all got pretty much quashed. It's true that we've got a lot of strengths to do this work. I mean, we've got a skilled labor force. We've got, market leaders in terms of the manufacturers, battery companies that could assist. We did have strong trade partners. I'm not sure how strong they are anymore. We had access to capital, but all that's kind of gotten and gone by the wayside. And so a lot of what I considered our strengths really aren't there as it sets right now. And the bottom line is that it's all at risk now, right? I mean, there just doesn't seem to be much of a desire, at least currently, to push the electric vehicle market forward. And as a result, I also see that the recycling market is probably somewhat in a pause as well. It's unfortunate because you'd like to see, a nice statistically some different options available. But the reality is for the time being, it looks like we're, in the drill baby drill era, at least for the near term. And as I mentioned, one of the challenges with rare earth minerals in general is that they're just not available to us here. Most of what is available sets in other countries, and they have, a robust supply chain for that purpose. You can see that most of it, as I mentioned, is controlled by China. There's actually some big reserves in Brazil and Vietnam, but they're not really mined to any great extent yet. But in terms of the United States, we have very, very little. And if we look at the three main minerals of interest for lithium-ion batteries in electric vehicles, we're talking about nickel, lithium, and cobalt. Almost all of the lithium comes from what we call the lithium triangle of Argentina, Bolivia, and Chile. Most of all the cobalt comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is neither democratic nor a republic. And probably our biggest issue is nickel. It's probably the one that's going to go away the quickest if we don't come up with other designs for our batteries. And because of this, this is why recycling would make good sense. There's money to be made if we can recycle our lithium-ion batteries. At least prior to January 20, we were projecting that our mineral demands were going to grow by about 30 times the existing demands by 2040 with lithium, with the fastest growth of about 12 to 15 times current estimates by 2030. So we were going to need a lot in order to grow at the rate that the Biden administration had anticipated. And this was going to be a challenge for us because we need that lithium in order to grow, but we didn't control the lithium. And one of the challenges, as I mentioned, with lithium mining is the environmental damage it causes. It takes a tremendous amount of water to mine lithium or to do it through evaporation ponds, which is what they do up in the mountains. And essentially what happens in the mountains is that over time, there's been the degradation or the erosion of the mountaintops, which carries the minerals. And then these minerals wind up in various wetlands and ponds. And then what they do is they spread it out. They let the water, which is in scarce supply as it is, they let the water evaporate, and then they wind up scooping up the various metals and minerals that are available. And this is typically what it looks like. But as I mentioned here, you know, for the effort that's required to do this type of evaporation, it's taking up tremendous amounts of water. So, as an example, if we look at what's happening again up in the Lithium Triangle, about 2/3 of the area's fresh water, drinking water supply is being used up in these evaporation ponds and is no longer available to the local populations. You can imagine, I don't see us doing that with the Great Salt Lake, right? I mean, it just doesn't work for us, not with our environmental regulations and the way that we view things. So it's highly likely that even if we were to attempt to ramp up our electric vehicle use, as was projected, that we would be purchasing where we could from other countries. And then again, the idea would have been we'd be trying to recycle to the best of our ability. So I think what it comes down to is, what's your preferred poison, right? We can try to increase our electrical vehicles and on the roads and so forth, but in order to do so, we're going to create damage somewhere, whether it's in this country or other countries. And it's more than just environmental damage. I know environmental justice isn't a big talking point right now with the new administration, but as an example, all that cobalt that's mined in the Congo is done by women and children, you know, for pennies a day. So it's a horrible situation that is fueling our demand for electric vehicles. But what we have right now is a real collision happening, and it's not only the collision between the administration and its policies that are going back more towards petroleum as our primary energy source, but we've got a mineral availability situation. What the Biden administration had proposed was that even if the minerals had come from other countries or had been refined in other countries and came to the United States, that if we did the recycling in this country, they would be considered a domestic source for tax purposes, which was going to promote recycling here and really give a leg up for our recyclers to jump into this business. Not sure that that's going to be the case anymore. We would have, again, had to get over the Superfund liability associated with the fact that we've got huge amounts of lithium already showing up in our drinking water supplies and in our groundwater supplies as it is. And then even if we got over those things, we're still left with, what will we do about disposal of what's left? And so there's really no easy solution to our issues. There have been some benefits and advances in new battery designs. But again, these things aren't going to take the place of what we've already produced. We are collecting lithium-ion batteries from cars. Huge amounts. And we don't know what to do with them. And this was going to be, again, a real opportunity for the recycling business to step up and make some money. The estimates are that the amount of money you can recoup from a lithium-ion car battery is somewhere around $1,200 to $2,500 per car, per battery, that's available to you from a recycling standpoint. The cool part is that you can recycle to infinity. These minerals really don't lose their power. Once they're recycled, they can be used again. So it could be an ongoing source of revenue for the recycling business, as well as an ongoing source of raw materials for our electric vehicles, if the money's put forward and the regulations are relaxed to give the recycling industry an opportunity to get a foothold and to start generating, our domestic opportunities. At least as it looks, currently, we're, a number of years away from that happening, which is unfortunate. For those of you, do we have anybody that's actually doing recycling of EV batteries or just the small lithium batteries? I know there's some. We don't really have much of a market, so it doesn't surprise me that we're not seeing that here. And one of the challenges is the regulations themselves. So the way our regulations are set up for car batteries right now is we got to talk about the recyclers and we got to talk about the handlers. There are specific rules and regulations associated with reuse first. And one of the challenges with reuse is if you are taking in a damaged battery, it's probably at that point going to be considered a hazardous waste because of the potential for reactivity or ignitability. And therefore, you're not going to be able to move it, if you will, under our existing reuse laws. And then as far as universal waste management goes, there are some very specific things that you can do as a handler, if you will, of lithium-ion car batteries. And as I mentioned here, you can sort them, you can discharge them so they're no longer a danger from a fire standpoint. You can disassemble them. All of these things are allowed under our current universal waste management regulations. And you don't need a hazardous waste permit or a RCRA permit to do those operations. And as I mentioned, that's as long as you're not dealing with batteries that are damaged. Now, once you get it to that point, let me jump ahead. What typically has been happening is they create this black mass through shredding. That's a recycling activity. There's a RCRA permit involved. And this is the point at which you can start to collect materials that have some sort of value to them. It's no longer a battery. And then at this point, things are separated out and they can be sent to different places for different reasons for recovery. And as I mentioned, one of the challenges here is straddling the difference between our RCRA hazardous waste laws and when things are considered a universal waste. And EPA has put out guidance as to how they would interpret different things that happen within the recycling field. At what point are you moving beyond universal waste management and into recycling? And these, as I mentioned earlier, were where we were developing our regulations. to try to give the recyclers additional guidance and comfort so they understood what they were doing and what set of regulations they would be under. At this point, it's in limbo again. It all got stopped as a result of January 20th. Oh, cool.
Yeah.
No, that's fine. So let me just jump to where I do see some opportunities though for the recycling business. I do believe that while this is all being sorted out, there is an opportunity to assist in developing strategies and looking at operational performance for various organizations that are involved in the automotive industry. And you all as recyclers are, you're close to it. You're probably the best ones to look at assisting in helping the automotive business identify methods for collecting and sorting and transporting and processing and so forth. I think that that expertise is still available, and there's opportunities to provide that sort of expertise to the automotive business. Anything to improve our recovery rates is going to be of great benefit. Anything along the lines of disseminating information about research and development is also going to be of great benefit to the industry. So I see that as an area that you all can still get involved in, even though a lot of what I thought was going to happen is ground to a halt, at least for the time being. For the engineers, for us, it's all going to be about wastewater and water treatment and what we do with lithium as it finds its way into our water, because we have zero room for any net additional lithium introduction into the environment based on our existing regulations, our projected regulations, and what already exists in the environment now based on the USGS studies. And so it kind of leaves us with, I propose adding a new element to the periodic table we're going to call because I don't know what we're going to do. And maybe we should just shit can it all and just go to hydrogen and not worry about lithium batteries at all. Just kind of move on, kind of the way we did with floppy disks, right? So that's all I have to say. Any questions?
That's great. Thanks very much, Dave. Well, thank you all for coming. Are there some questions for Nick before we break up for lunch? This was a great opportunity to hear some things maybe that were a little bit ancillary to what you normally do, but I think they're important to realize that there are parts of your process that probably have the ability to get regulated in the next little while that maybe you didn't factor in, PFAs being that. And maybe there are some additional opportunities that you didn't recognize with the lithium battery market. But as a toxicologist, I'm not going to weigh in on that. So thanks very much for coming. If you want to, we'll stick around for a few minutes, and I think the next.
Chris,
Yes,
just
ma'am.
one comment. Keita Corey, the Florida Recycling Partnership Foundation. Just at FYI, there will be some battery legislation coming forward during the Florida session that will start March 4th. We're having, like WM, for example, had 150 trucks catch fire just last year in Florida, and it was 80% of them were due to batteries.
To unknown batteries collected in the waste stream.
Exactly. So we're going on a big push. DEP, Karen Moore's here. She's got a great program called Take Charge Florida, educational program on there. But batteries are at the top of our list of looking at how are we going to handle this material.
Okay. I would suggest that if anybody has questions about that, you direct them to Keena or to, is it Morris, Ms. Morris? Okay. Okay. Thanks very much. We'll talk with you soon.
Just want to let you know